The mountain village of Ashford Hollow had never been kind to Elias Thorne. At 17, he was a fixture of mockery. The gangly boy with patches on his patches, whose father had disappeared into the mines 5 years prior, leaving nothing but debt and a crumbling stone cottage on the furthest edge of town. The other young men, sons of merchants and landowners, would sneer as he passed, their laughter echoing off the weathered buildings that lined the narrow streets. "There goes the mountain rat," they'd call out, their voices dripping with contempt, "off to dig through trash with his mangy mutt." The mutt in question was Scout, a wire-haired mongrel with one torn ear and eyes that held more wisdom than half the town council. Elias had found him 3 winters ago, half frozen in a snowdrift, and nursed him back to health with what little food he could spare. Since then, the dog had been his constant companion, more loyal than any human had ever been. Elias worked odd jobs, hauling water, chopping wood, clearing snow from the wealthier homes, but it was never enough. The cottage his family had owned for generations was falling apart, quite literally. The roof leaked in a dozen places, the eastern wall had developed a dangerous crack, and worst of all, the property taxes were 6 months overdue. Old Magistrate Hendricks had made it clear, pay up by winter's end, or the cottage would be seized and sold at auction. On this particular October morning, as frost painted the valley white and the first hint of winter's bite hung in the air, Elias sat on the sagging porch of his cottage, watching the sunrise paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Scout lay beside him, occasionally thumping his tail against the worn boards. "We're going to lose it, boy," Elias murmured, running his fingers through the dog's rough coat. 3 more months, and we'll be sleeping in the streets, if they even let us stay in town." Scout whined softly, pressing his head against Elias's leg. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. 3 riders were making their way up the mountain path, the Brennan brothers, sons of the wealthiest mine owner in the region, accompanied by their usual gang of hangers-on. They reined in their horses at the edge of Elias's property, sneering down at him from their mounts. "Well, well," called Marcus Brennan, the eldest, a thick-shouldered man of 25, with a cruel mouth and cold eyes. "Still clinging to this pile of rubble, Thorne? I've told my father he should buy this land when you default. We'll tear down this eyesore and build something proper." "Maybe a stable," added his brother Thomas to the laughter of their companions. "Seems fitting. It already smells like one." Elias felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that words only made things worse with men like the Brennans. Scout, however, had no such restraint. The dog rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Call off that flea-bag, mountain boy," Marcus snapped, his hand moving to the riding crop at his belt, "or I'll put it down myself." "Scout, easy," Elias said quietly, placing a hand on the dog's head. To the riders, he said nothing, simply meeting Marcus's gaze with steady silence. The standoff lasted a moment longer before Marcus spat into the dirt and wheeled his horse around. "Enjoy your last few months in that hovel," he called over his shoulder. "Come January, you'll be begging for scraps at our door." As the riders disappeared down the mountain trail, Elias let out a long breath. Scout sat down again, but his ears remained alert, tracking the fading sounds of hoofbeats. "I know, boy," Elias said. "I don't like them either." The rest of the day passed in the usual drudgery. Elias spent the morning chopping firewood for Mrs. Weatherby, an elderly widow who at least treated him with kindness, if not respect. She paid him with a loaf of bread and 3 coppers, barely enough for a meal, but more than some offered. In the afternoon, he hauled stones for a wall repair at the blacksmith's, earning another handful of coins that would barely make a dent in his mounting debts. By the time he trudged home at sunset, his muscles ached and his hands were raw with blisters. Scout trotted beside him, occasionally darting off the path to investigate some scent or sound, but always returning to his side. The cottage looked even more forlorn in the dying light. The crack in the eastern wall had widened. He could see it from 50 yards away. Soon, the whole wall might collapse, and then it wouldn't matter if he could pay the taxes or not. The place would be uninhabitable. "Maybe I should just let it go," he said to Scout as they climbed the porch steps. "Start fresh somewhere else. Find work in one of the coastal cities." But even as he said it, he knew he wouldn't. This cottage held every memory he had of his mother, who died when he was 10, and his father, who'd vanished into a collapsed mine shaft when Elias was 12. Leaving would feel like abandoning them all over again. Inside, he lit a candle and surveyed the damage with fresh eyes. The leak in the kitchen had gotten worse. There was a puddle beneath it, and the plaster was crumbling. The front room wasn't much better, and he hadn't even been up to the attic in months. God only knew what condition that was in. Scout suddenly perked up, his ears swiveling toward the ceiling. A moment later, Elias heard it too, a scraping, scratching sound from directly overhead. "Probably squirrels," he muttered, "or rats. Just what we need." But Scout was already moving toward the narrow staircase that led to the attic, his tail wagging with unusual excitement. The dog paused at the bottom step, looking back at Elias expectantly. "You want to go chase rodents at this hour?" Elias sighed, but he grabbed the candle and followed. The attic stairs creaked ominously under his weight. He'd avoided coming up here for months, knowing that confronting the full extent of the cottage's decay would only depress him further. But Scout was insistent, bounding up the steps and disappearing into the darkness above. When Elias reached the top, he held the candle high, casting flickering light across a space he barely recognized. The roof had failed in several places, letting in rain that had rotted the floorboards and destroyed most of what had been stored there. Old furniture, his mother's trunks of clothes, his father's mining equipment, all of it was water-damaged, moldy, ruined. Scout was at the far end of the attic, pawing at something in the corner where the roof sloped down to meet the floor. His excitement had only increased, and now he was whining urgently, looking back at Elias as if to say, "Come see this." "What did you find, boy? A nest of mice." But as Elias approached, he saw that the dog was focused on a section of the wall where the plaster had fallen away, revealing the old stone beneath. And there, barely visible in the candlelight, was a gap, a space where the stones didn't quite meet. Elias knelt down, setting the candle aside carefully. His heart was beating faster now, though he couldn't say why. He reached into the gap, his fingers brushing against something that wasn't stone or wood. It was leather, old and dry, wrapped around something flat and rectangular. With trembling hands, he pulled it free. The leather covering crumbled at his touch, falling away to reveal what lay beneath. A oilskin package, carefully sealed with wax, and beneath that, visible through a clear panel, was a piece of parchment covered in faded ink, lines, symbols, notations, a map. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the oilskin, revealing 3 sheets of parchment inside. The first was indeed a map, but unlike any he'd ever seen. It showed the mountains around Ashford Hollow in incredible detail, with dozens of markings and annotations in a cramped, urgent hand. The second sheet was covered in what looked like calculations and measurements. And the third? The third made his hands shake so badly he nearly dropped everything. It was a letter written in his father's hand. "My dearest Elias," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry for that. But perhaps I've left you something better than I ever could have given you in life. I've found it, son. The lost Magdalene mine. It's real, and I know where it is." Elias read his father's letter 3 times that night, each word burning itself into his memory as the candle guttered lower. His father's handwriting, unchanged from the notes Elias had saved from his childhood, covered the page in tight, excited script. "The mine has haunted these mountains for 200 years, the letter continued. Every treasure hunter and fool with a dream has searched for it, but they all looked in the wrong places. They followed the legend that the Spanish had hidden their silver in the high peaks near the old mission, but I found the journal of Father Magdalena himself, hidden in the archives of a monastery 3 valleys over. The priest lied. Elias. He lied to protect his discovery. The mine isn't in the high peaks, it's in the low reaches, in the canyon system everyone avoids because of the unstable ground." Elias's hands trembled as he turned to the detailed map. His father had marked what looked like a route through terrain he'd never explored, a narrow canyon that twisted deep into the mountain's heart. There were warnings scrawled in the margins: flash flood danger, unstable overhangs, possible cave-ins. But there was also a clear X, marked with the words, "Main shaft entrance," sealed but intact. "I was going to tell you everything," his father's letter went on. "I was going to take you there, show you what I'd found. But the Brennan mine collapse happened, and I made a terrible mistake, son. I knew that shaft was dangerous. I'd surveyed it 2 months earlier and reported the instability, but the Brennans pressured the foreman to keep digging. When I heard they'd sent a crew in that morning, I rushed to stop them. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't even on the work roster, but I couldn't let those men die." Elias's eyes blurred with tears. He'd never known the full story of his father's death. The official report had simply said, "accidental death in mine collapse," and the Brennans had paid the families enough to keep them quiet. But now, reading these words, he understood. His father had died a hero, trying to save others from a disaster he'd predicted. "The Brennans know I found something," the letter continued, the handwriting becoming more rushed, less controlled. "Marcus confronted me 3 days ago. He said his father knows I've been spending my off hours in the mountains, and they want to know why. I denied everything, but he threatened you and your mother, said accidents happen in the mines all the time. I'm going to hide this map where only you will find it, in the place your mother and I had our first kiss, in the attic corner where we carved our initials into the stone. Remember, Elias, scout the eastern sky at dawn and follow the dog star home. Your loving father, Jeremiah Thorne." Scout whined, pressing his nose against Elias's arm. The words, "follow the dog star," seemed to resonate strangely in the quiet attic. Elias looked at his faithful companion, wondering if his father had somehow known that he would name a dog scout years after this letter was written. Or was it just coincidence? He turned to the calculations on the second sheet. His father had been an educated man, rare for a miner, and had taught Elias mathematics and geology in the evenings by lamplight. Now those lessons paid off, as Elias deciphered the numbers. His father had estimated the silver content of the mine based on ore samples he'd somehow obtained. The calculations went on for pages, accounting for extraction costs, refining, transportation, and market prices. At the bottom, underlined 3 times, was a single figure that made Elias's heart stop. Conservative estimate of remaining silver, 4,800 tons. Current market value, approximately $120 million. $120 million. Elias sat back, his mind reeling. It couldn't be real. It had to be a fantasy, a dream his father had chased into madness. But the map was real, the calculations were methodical, and his father had died protecting this secret. He barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the map's lines, his father's handwriting, that impossible number. By the time dawn broke, he'd made his decision. He would find the mine. But he couldn't do it alone, and he couldn't do it unprepared. The route his father had marked would take at least 3 days to traverse, through terrain that could kill him in a dozen different ways. He'd need supplies, equipment, and knowledge he didn't possess. There was one person in Ashford Hollow who might help, old Samuel, the retired cartographer who lived in a cabin on the south side of town. Samuel had been his father's friend, one of the few people who'd spoken kindly of Jeremiah Thorne after his death. But could Elias trust him with this secret? He had no choice. Without guidance, he'd just end up as dead as all the other treasure hunters who'd searched for the Magdalene mine. Elias found Samuel in his workshop, surrounded by maps and surveying equipment. The old man looked up as Elias entered, his weathered face creasing into a smile that faded when he saw the younger man's expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost, boy." "Maybe I have." Elias glanced around, making sure they were alone, then carefully unfolded his father's map on the workbench. "I found this in my attic, my father's last survey." Samuel's eyes widened as he bent over the map, his gnarled fingers tracing the lines. "Good Lord," he whispered, "he actually found it. I always wondered." "You knew?" "I suspected. Jeremiah asked me strange questions in the months before he died. About old Spanish mining techniques, about geological surveys of the low reaches. I thought he was just curious, but—" Samuel looked up, his eyes sharp despite his age. "This is dangerous, Elias. Not just because of the terrain. The Brennans will kill to keep this secret if they find out." "They already killed," Elias said quietly, "my father. They caused that collapse." Samuel nodded slowly. "I've always thought so, but never could prove it. Marcus Brennan has his father's cruelty and twice his ambition." He studied the map again. "You're planning to go, aren't you?" "I have to. I'm going to lose the cottage anyway. This is my only chance." "Then you'll need help." Samuel moved to a cabinet and began pulling out equipment, a compass, a modern geological survey map, rope, climbing gear. "I'm too old to go with you, but I can prepare you. The low reaches are treacherous, but your father's route is clever. He's avoided the worst of the flood zones and marked safe campsites. Still, you'll need to move fast. This time of year, a storm could roll in without warning." They spent the next 2 days in preparation. Samuel taught Elias to read topographical maps, to recognize signs of unstable ground, to predict weather from the clouds and wind. He provided supplies, dried food, a good tent, proper climbing equipment, refusing payment with a wave of his hand. "Your father saved my son's life in that collapse," Samuel said, "pushed him out of the way before the ceiling came down. This is the least I can do." But the most valuable thing Samuel gave him was a warning. "The Brennans have eyes everywhere," the old man said on the evening before Elias's departure. "They'll know within hours if you head into the mountains. You'll need a cover story, and you'll need to move when they're distracted." As if summoned by the mention of their name, news arrived that evening that solved both problems. The Brennans were hosting a 3-day celebration for Marcus's engagement to the daughter of a wealthy industrialist from the capital. The entire town was invited. It would be the social event of the season. "Perfect," Samuel said. "Everyone will be in town, drinking and carrying on. No one will notice if one outcast mountain boy and his dog slip away into the wilderness." Elias spent his last evening in the cottage, packing and repacking his supplies, making sure everything was secure. Scout seemed to sense something was happening, staying close and watching his every move with those intelligent eyes. "We're going on an adventure, boy," Elias told him, scratching behind the dog's torn ear. "Just like the old stories father used to tell, except this time the treasure is real." That night, as fireworks from the Brennan celebration lit the sky over Ashford Hollow, Elias shouldered his pack and slipped out of town. Scout trotted beside him, tail wagging, as they climbed the mountain trail under a canopy of stars. The journey began easily enough. Elias followed an old hunting path that wound through pine forests and across rocky slopes. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and for the first time in years, he felt something like hope. But by the second day, the terrain had grown more challenging. The path his father had marked took them off the established trails and into a maze of narrow canyons and steep ravines. Several times, Elias had to use the climbing rope Samuel had provided, lowering himself down cliff faces, with Scout whining anxiously from above before scrambling down on his own. They made camp that night in a shallow cave, a site his father had marked as safe harbor water nearby. True to the notation, a small spring trickled from the rocks nearby. As Elias prepared a simple meal over a small fire, Scout suddenly went rigid, ears pricked forward. "What is it, boy?" Then he heard it, hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Impossible. There was no horse trail down here. But the sounds were unmistakable, growing closer. Elias quickly doused his fire and pulled Scout deeper into the cave, his heart hammering. Through the gathering darkness, he saw them, 3 riders, picking their way carefully through the rocky canyon. Even at a distance, he recognized the lead horseman's silhouette, Marcus Brennan. They'd been followed. Elias pressed himself against the back of the cave, one hand clamped over Scout's muzzle to keep the dog silent. The riders passed within 50 yards of their hiding place, close enough that he could hear Marcus's voice carrying on the canyon wind. He came this way, the tracker's certain of it. The question is why? What's that wretched boy doing out here? Maybe just hunting, offered another voice. Thomas Brennan. In the low reaches. Don't be stupid. No one comes down here unless they're desperate or stupid, or unless they know something we don't. Marcus's voice sharpened. Father always said Jeremiah Thorne was sniffing around something valuable before he died. What if the son found whatever the father was hiding? Should we turn back? It'll be dark soon, and these canyons are a maze, suggested a third voice, one of the hired men. Turn back? Marcus's laugh was harsh. And let that mountain rat claim whatever treasure his father died protecting? No. We camp here tonight. At first light we find him. And when we do... He left the threat unfinished, but the menace in his voice was clear enough. The riders moved on, their voices fading into the distance. Elias waited a full hour before daring to move, his mind racing. They knew. Somehow, despite all his precautions, the Brennans knew he'd left town and where he was heading. Samuel's warning echoed in his mind. They have eyes everywhere. Someone in town must have talked, or perhaps the Brennans had been watching his cottage all along. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that he was being hunted, and he had maybe half a day's head start at best. Scout whined softly, licking his hand. Elias scratched the dog's head, thinking hard. He could turn back, abandon the search, return to town, and hope the Brennans didn't press him. But that would mean losing everything. The cottage, his father's legacy, his only chance at a different life. Or he could move forward faster than planned and hope to reach the mine before Marcus caught up with him. "Come on, boy," he whispered. "We're not giving up now." He traveled through the night, using the stars and his father's map to navigate. The canyon system was a labyrinth, but Jeremiah Thorne's notations proved uncannily accurate. Each landmark was exactly where it should be, a split boulder shaped like a broken tooth, a waterfall cascading down a copper-stained cliff face, a natural arch framing the distant peaks. By dawn, Elias was exhausted, but according to his calculations, he was less than 2 miles from his destination. The canyon had narrowed to a steep-walled gorge, barely 20 feet wide, its floor a tumble of boulders worn smooth by ancient floods. Scout suddenly stopped, hackles raised, staring back the way they'd come. A moment later, Elias heard it, shouting, echoing through the canyon. The Brennans had found his trail. He broke into a run, heedless of the risk, scrambling over rocks and splashing through shallow streams. Scout kept pace beside him, the dog's athletic build allowing him to leap from boulder to boulder with ease. The gorge made a sharp bend, and there, Elias's breath caught, was exactly what his father had described. The canyon wall bore the unmistakable marks of human work. Dressed stone forming the outline of a doorway, now blocked by a carefully constructed wall of native rock, made to look natural. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd walk right past it. Elias dropped his pack and began tearing at the rocks with his bare hands. They'd been placed without mortar, meant to be removed and replaced. Behind him, the shouts were getting closer. He could hear Marcus clearly now. "Spread out! He's close!" The rocks came away faster than he'd hoped. His father must have loosened them years ago, knowing that someday, someone, ideally his son, would need quick access. Within minutes, Elias had created a gap large enough to squeeze through. "Scout, come!" The dog bounded through the opening. Elias grabbed his pack and followed, then frantically began pulling rocks back into place from inside. He'd just settled the last stone when he heard voices directly outside. "Nothing here," someone said. "Just another dead end." "No," Marcus's voice was sharp. "Look at the ground, fresh scuff marks. He came this way." A pause. "Start searching. Check every crack, every crevice. He's hiding somewhere close." In the darkness, Elias fumbled for his flashlight. When he clicked it on, the beam revealed a tunnel, sloping downward into the mountain. The walls bore tool marks, picks and chisels, and here and there, the glint of metal veins in the rock. He'd found it. The lost Magdalene mine. The tunnel went deeper than he'd expected, branching occasionally into side passages that his father had marked with chalked arrows on his map. Elias followed the main shaft, moving as quickly as he dared. The air was cool and damp, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 20 minutes, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Elias's flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls or the ceiling, but what it did illuminate made him gasp. Silver. Everywhere. The walls glittered with veins of ore, so pure they looked like frozen rivers of moonlight. Support timbers, ancient hand-hewn beams, showed where Spanish miners had worked centuries ago, extracting the most accessible deposits. But they'd barely scratched the surface. The chamber extended in multiple directions, each passage promising more wealth than Elias could comprehend. His father's estimate of 4,800 tons suddenly seemed conservative. Scout barked once, sharply, and Elias spun around. A light was growing in the tunnel behind them, torches or electric lanterns moving fast. "He's down here!" Marcus's voice boomed through the passages. "I can see his light." Elias ran deeper into the mine, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. He needed somewhere to hide, somewhere to think. A side passage caught his attention. His father had marked it with a double arrow and the words, "Main Office, Records Intact." He ducked into the passage, Scout close behind. It opened into a smaller chamber that had clearly served as the mine's administrative center. A massive wooden desk sat against one wall, remarkably preserved by the dry air. Shelves held ledgers and documents, all carefully wrapped in oilskin, and in the corner, an iron strongbox. But there was no other exit. He was trapped. Marcus's voice echoed from the main chamber. "Come out, Thorn. Make this easy on yourself. We just want to talk." "Like you talked to my father?" Elias shouted back, surprising himself with his own courage. A pause. Then Marcus laughed. "So you know about that, do you? Your father was a fool. He found this place and thought he could negotiate with us. Thought he could trade his discovery for a partnership. But the Brennans don't share, boy. We take. You killed him." "I saved him from a worse fate," Marcus called back, and now his voice was closer. "A mining accident is quick at least. What I'll do to you if you don't surrender, that will take days." Elias looked around desperately. Scout was sniffing at the strongbox, pawing at it urgently. On impulse, Elias tried the lid. It wasn't locked. The internal mechanism had rusted away long ago. Inside were more documents, a bag of old Spanish coins, and something else. Sticks of dynamite, ancient but possibly still functional. Spanish miners had used black powder, but this was something more modern, probably left by a later explorer or survey team. Elias had watched enough mining operations to know the basics. A fuse, a spark, and... Scout barked again, more insistently. The dog had moved to the back corner of the chamber, pawing at the floor. Elias shined his light there and saw what the dog had found, a crack in the floor, wide enough for water to drain through, or for a person and a dog to squeeze into, if they were desperate enough. He heard footsteps in the passage. Marcus was coming. Elias worked quickly. He took 2 sticks of dynamite and placed them in the office doorway, then carefully threaded a fuse from his pack through them. It would give him maybe 30 seconds once lit. Enough time to get into that crack, he hoped, but not much more. "Last chance, Thorn." Marcus appeared at the passage entrance, his face illuminated by the electric lantern in his hand. Behind him, Elias could see Thomas and 3 other men, all armed. "You're right," Elias said. "Last chance." He lit the fuse. Marcus's eyes went wide. "You idiot! You'll bring the whole mountain down! Then I guess we all die together." Elias dove for the crack in the floor as Marcus and his men scrambled backward. Scout was already squeezing through, and Elias followed, scraping his shoulders raw as he forced himself into the narrow opening. The fuse was burning fast, too fast. He'd miscalculated. The world exploded. The blast was deafening in the confined space, and the shockwave hit like a physical blow. Elias felt himself falling, tumbling through darkness as rock and debris rained down. He hit water, ice-cold and moving fast, and was swept away by an underground stream he hadn't known existed. He surfaced, gasping, his flashlight miraculously still clipped to his belt. Its beam showed a low-ceiling tunnel carved by millennia of water flow. Scout was paddling beside him, dog paddling frantically to keep his head above water. Behind them he could hear more explosions, the chain reaction he'd hoped for. The blast had triggered a collapse, sealing off the main chamber and possibly the entire upper mine. If Marcus and his men hadn't made it out, Elias pushed the thought away. He had his own problems. The current was carrying them deeper into the mountain, and he had no idea where this underground river led. It could end in a siphon, drowning them both, or it could lead to freedom. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they were swept through the darkness. Elias's body was battered against rocks, and more than once he went under, swallowing mouthfuls of mineral-bitter water. Scout stayed close, the dog's determination to survive matching his own. Then ahead, was that light? The tunnel was brightening. The current grew faster, more turbulent. Elias realized with horror what was happening just before it occurred. The underground river was emptying into a waterfall. They went over the edge together, plummeting 20 feet into a deep pool at the base of the cliff. Elias surfaced in water that tasted of sunlight and fresh air, his lungs burning, his body screaming with pain. Scout surfaced beside him, paddling toward the shore. They'd made it out. The waterfall emptied into a stream that ran through a narrow valley Elias had never seen before, on the far side of the mountain from Ashford Hollow. He dragged himself onto the rocky shore and lay there, staring up at the sky. Scout collapsed beside him. They'd survived, but at what cost? 3 months later, Elias stood in the office of the territorial governor, wearing a suit that still felt strange after a lifetime in work clothes. The room was lined with important-looking people, lawyers, mining engineers, government officials, all reviewing the documents he'd recovered from the Magdalen Mines office. The collapse had sealed the main entrance, but the documents he'd saved told the whole story, original Spanish mining claims, carefully preserved by Father Magdalena, surveys showing the extent of the silver deposits, and most damning, a journal detailing how the Brennans had learned of Jeremiah Thorne's discovery and arranged his death. It turned out that Scout's nose had saved more than their lives. When the dog had pawed at that strongbox, he'd been drawn to the scent of the documents inside, documents that proved both the mine's legitimacy and the Brennans' crime. Marcus Brennan had survived the collapse, but 2 of his men hadn't. He was now facing trial for murder, not just of Jeremiah Thorne, but of those two men he'd led into a death trap. His family's mining empire was in ruins, their other operations shut down pending investigation. The mine itself is lost, the territorial mining engineer was saying. The collapse was too extensive. It would cost millions to excavate, and it's not safe. But, he smiled, based on the ore samples you brought out and the assay records in these documents, we can confirm your father's estimates were accurate. The mine contains approximately 4,800 tons of recoverable silver. Which you can't recover, Elias pointed out. Not conventionally, but the territorial government is prepared to buy the mining claim based on the verified reserves. We'll deal with the engineering challenges. Your compensation would be... The engineer consulted his notes. $115 million. The number hung in the air. Elias felt dizzy. Additionally, the governor said, stepping forward, the territory wishes to honor your father's memory. He died trying to prevent a tragedy caused by the Brennan's negligence. We're establishing a mine safety commission in his name, and I'm appointing you to its board if you're interested. Elias found his voice. I'm interested. That evening, he walked the streets of Ashford Hollow, Scout trotting beside him as always. Word had spread quickly. The boy they'd mocked was now the richest man in the territory. People who'd crossed the street to avoid him now smiled and nodded. The shopkeepers who'd refused him credit now offered him everything for free. He stopped at old Samuel's workshop. The cartographer looked up from his maps and broke into a genuine smile. I heard, Samuel said. Your father would be proud. I couldn't have done it without his map, without you. Elias pulled an envelope from his pocket. I want you to have this. It's not charity. It's payment for the supplies and guidance, and friendship. Samuel opened the envelope and paled when he saw the bank draft inside. This is too much. It's not enough, but it's a start. As Elias walked home, to his cottage, now repaired and expanded with the first installment of his payment, he thought about his father's final words in that letter. Scout the eastern sky at dawn and follow the dog star home. His father had known. Somehow, across years and death, Jeremiah Thorne had known that a stray dog with one torn ear would lead his son to salvation. Scout barked once, chasing after a butterfly in the twilight, and Elias laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. The mountain had taken his father, but it had given him back his future, and sometimes that was all the treasure a man needed.